any of our abilities to do that, like when we're trying to sell these things.
Well, I mean, it's funny, and we talked about this a little bit before the thing. I mean, if I was to put my advertising hat on now, one of the number one goals of going into a meeting now with a brand is to say, guess what? I mean, if you've ever set up a social radar, there's a really interesting tool out of a group in Toronto called Sysomos, and Sysomos is able to track all social interactions online regarding your brand. And if you start to show that to a brand, and you say, look, conversations and stories about your brand are happening without you being there, right? And in order for you have to be present in the conversation, but you can't control the conversation. And that's kind of, you would say the same thing to an author now.
That's very much about, the comparison now.
Yeah, I mean, you would have to say the same thing to an author. It's not about the control of the story elements now. It's setting up the frameworks so that hopefully it goes in the direction that you want, right? But it's a bit more of a free world. Okay. Did you want to ask a question? Is there a microphone? Oh, yeah. I'm going to say something you tweeted. I ate a banana.
Everyone should feel free to jump in as well, because this is a pretty
it should
broad
be
issue.
interactive.
Sorry, making it interactive. Right. Hi, Sarah Diamond. I'm finding the conversation really curious because partly it's my aging process, but back in the 90s, before the first big tech crash, there were a couple of companies. One was called Broderbund and the other Voyager. And, they used this old format called the CD-ROM. And there was a game called Myst. And some of the qualities of those, those two brands and then Myst were either branching narratives, they were adventure games, they were trying to work out in many products the experience of interactive drama. And it seems to me the difference in part with what you're describing is that it's gone online, but we're kind of back trying to figure out the rules of the game for interactive narratives. Some of those products were incredibly successful, and one could argue that the distribution medium didn't exist yet, that the internet now provides, and there were some challenges there. But I'm wondering why there's a kind of gap, because I do feel like it's as though a whole history of incredibly powerful products, some of which are still actually now making money out there, kind of doesn't exist. And I look at your work, and it's branching narrative, and and now, in fact, we have the AI tools in some ways, which Evan, you were kind of pointing to, in some ways to drive characters and introduce questions and complexity. And so just a comment on where you see bridges between what you're doing now and some of that work, if there are any.
I mean, I think Myst was a confluence of a number of things, right? I mean, it was graphics that we had never seen before. It was sound design that we had never felt or heard before. And it was sort of ahead of its time. The narrative was, I mean, I can't remember the story, really. I was on an island.
There are two brothers.
Yeah, that's right.
You got to pick the brother at the end.
Yeah, exactly. But you're right. And that's kind of my confusion. I don't know why we're still trying to figure out a model when the model has worked on a number of occasions, a number of different times. I mean, I have this book and I think I've shown it to you. I have this book in my office from 1932 in Great Britain called "Herewith Lie the Clues" by a guy named Dennis Wheatley. And basically, what it is, it's a crime dossier, a report about crime, and then there's little envelopes in there with hair follicles and with matchsticks and crime scene photos and all this stuff. No real story, but you start to, put the meaning together. And at the end, there's like a little sealed thing that you open, and it tells you the result, but you have to fill out the police report before you compare it to the actual result that happened to and it's really fascinating. It's a compelling model, but that was 1932. And it sold 150,000 copies in the UK, this particular printing. So clearly there are things that we can draw, but we're still kind of now that we have these greater distribution mechanisms, where do I go?
That's the issue for me too. It's and the question for me is, where do you put the user? And with Myst, you put the user in the protagonist, which is the person going around and making the actions in the story, and the conflicts are presented directly, and lots of games are built that way, where the things you overcome are your own things that are affecting you. I mean, some of the projects that I've done, you become sort of the protagonist's helper, and you're pushing the protagonist through the story, but you're also in the protagonist's sphere of influence. But what Mike's describing is that now you're the author. The user is inserted as the author, not as the protagonist. The things are happening, and they have happened. And you were saying about the tense of interactive stories. That's a past tense story. And now you are the one who's telling it. and that's where the user gets injected. I mean, it's I'm going to go off on a quick tangent, but which is that I was trying to make a list, and I was like, so the protagonist, the author, and I was like, how about the antagonist? I was like, is the user ever the antagonist? And I was like, that doesn't really work in the right way, because you're always seeing the story through the lens of your own experience.
But I will say that, like, from my own experience, like, one of the things we had to decide very early on when we were producing our project was, were we going to shoot it like POV style, like, so there's no character in front, it's just the camera moving through and you have to figure out what's going on, or whether we wanted to follow a character and have the user make choices for that character. And just because we started shooting some tests and we just felt like it was going to be stronger graphically to shoot with a character, we decided to do that. And one of the things that is interesting about it is that the audience, in many times, because we're using an analytics package on it, we can tell what choices are made and how many people are making those choices, want to be antagonizing within the narrative. They want to pick, they know which one they're leaning towards, and they want to pick the opposite because they want to see what happens. And they know that something bad might happen, or that it might end up in an end to the experience, but they don't care because they want to see how that works and how that plays. And I wonder, in your Castaway example, if there's some similar, you know, in many ways the choices.
Oh yeah,
like,
they always chose the nasty.
Right.
Choice. It was great. But I think the other thing, just going back to your statement about why are we still trying to reinvent the wheel when it's been invented, is this sounds like a cliche, but the audience is increasingly sophisticated. Never before have they had the tools of self-publishing that they have now. So, you know, unless they had their own Gutenberg press, they couldn't publish their own version of the Bible. And now every kind of 12-year-old can do that. So I think that's one of the reasons we're all getting mired in the complexities of this debate, is because there's so many options available. But actually, telling a good story is just about having a beginning, a middle, and end, and great characters that people want to engage in.
Also, just for me, like, my example, we created a very minimal amount of interactivity and real choice in our story. And that was, if you actually go through it, there's really no choice. It just appears to be choice. And there's a couple reasons for that. A, because to make choice costs time and money in production scheduling and having to figure out how that branching narrative will actually work. And one of the things we wanted to do is to see if people were willing to make a choice before we were going to get into the bigger question of what choices they were going to make, how far were they going to go with those choices. So we it was almost like a prototype for us. The other thing is that our if you watch our film, like, it's very graphic based, like there's black and white and then these highlights of purple, and there's moments of, or a moment of CGI in it. And so it was less important for us to really get deep into the interactivity as it was to create a fully formed film that spoke to sort of all of our capabilities. But one of the things that I felt like I was cheating, because I wanted to get into the bigger questions. I wanted to do the bigger moments of interactivity. I wanted to try to find a new model, but really, like, when I hear responses from people, they almost like that there's some limited choice in it, and it isn't so big because they feel like they can get through it. And I think that's one of the things that I'm constantly struggling with, is like, I want to find all these new models. I keep having these panels where I moderate them, trying to talk to smart people and figure out what the deal is. But then, you know, when you actually go to apply it or pitch it to a brand or whatever that end result is that you have to do to get into production, you know, it's like, what can you really do, and what's worth doing? Because sometimes, you know, there's a reason why, like, choose your own adventure books were the biggest selling genre of books for kids in the 80s. It's because, like, it was really pretty straightforward what it was, you know, and all you had to do is just attach a new story to that system of interactivity. So I think there's a model to do that over and over and over, and with great stories potentially have examples like this YouTube video where pretty straightforward what you're doing. You're making a choice between 3 options, and that continues.